Many of you have requested for part 2, so here it is. If at the start of the year I were to tell you that Trump was able to convince all of the US trading partners to accept a 10% tariff and that the trading partners will be happy with it, you would have said I'm crazy. But that's exactly what Trump accomplished. And today, I'm going to be breaking down the numbers to all this madness. Today, it's going to be a little bit more numbers intensive, so let us all put on our smarty pants cap. When this whole tariff fiasco started, I decided to crunch some numbers by preparing this Excel so I can get a better understanding and get behind the mind of Trump and his team. And I believe I may have found his secret plan behind this. Now, just as a disclaimer, all the information that I'm sharing with you today is for educational and informational purposes only and does not contribute to any financial investment or legal advice. Okay? So guys, remember to do your own due diligence. So the Excel that you see in front of you represents the balance sheet of the US government. So as we can see, as of 2024, the US government collected a tax revenue of $4.9 trillion, out of which this revenue comprises of individual income taxes, which accounts to $2.4 trillion, which is the bulk of it, or 49% of the revenue that the US government received. $1.7 trillion comes from Social Security and Medicare taxes, and around 11% comes from the corporate income tax. And of course, there are some other revenue sources as well. Now, I've also broken down the expense side of the US government balance sheet. In total, in 2024, they've spent $6.75 trillion and they only collected $4.2 trillion. So that's why they actually have a net fiscal deficit of $1.8 trillion. Now, out of all the expenses that the US government has, it is basically comprised of two different types of spending mainly. On one side, we have the mandatory spending. On the other side, we have discretionary spending. So when it comes to mandatory spending, we're talking about Social Security, income security, Medicare, Medicaid, veteran benefits and services. And for the discretionary side, we're talking about national defense, healthcare, education, transportation, and etc, etc, etc. So you notice I actually highlighted some of the expenses in orange. Now, why did I highlight in orange is because these are expenses that I believe the Doge, which is led by Elon Musk, will have difficulty trying to cut expenses from over here. So if you can just scroll down, you'll notice that I have this calculation of the gross fiscal balance. So how do I derive this is I take the tax revenue minus all the mandatory spending minus defense and health, right? Remember, these are spending that I don't believe Doge will be able to cut a lot of. And that amounts to $197 billion. And just for extra knowledge, the US national debt as of 2024 amounts to $35,460 billion. And the new interest rate, if let's say the US government were to refinance it at current rates, amounts to 4.33%, which means that the annual interest expense, if they were to refinance at the current rates, will be $1.5 trillion every single year, right? And that is why I believe Donald Trump is trying to lower down the rates because a bulk of it is due for refinancing. Now, as we know, according to the Bloomberg terminal, there's around an estimated of $9 trillion worth of US government debt that is due for refinancing this year. And if we understand the composition of the US debt, as you can see from the government website, 51% of them are treasury notes, which are usually in a duration of roughly 10 years. So I think the 10-year treasury yield is going to be a very, very important thing to watch because I believe that will be what Donald Trump will want to influence in order to make the refinancing better. After all, who would want to refinance at higher rates? So let's take a look at the second portion of this Excel of the balance sheet of US government. So this is where I ran through certain scenarios to kind of get into the sensing of what is the mind behind Donald Trump and all the actions. And I believe it is through this that I managed to find out their secret plan. So let's have a look. On the first row, you can see that the debt that is due for refinancing this year, which is estimated to be about $9 trillion. And based on the 10-year Treasury yield at the current moment, we are talking about 4.33%, which is the estimated interest expense for this year at least of $389 billion. And when we take into account the gross fiscal balance, which is $197 billion, and assuming that currently Doge has already saved $160 billion, we are talking still a negative position when it comes to the refinancing itself. So I do believe, there needs to be some action being done. Number one, on lowering the interest rates, and number two, also increasing the amount of savings that Doge can give in order to put the government balance sheet after refinancing into the green. Let me just share with you first on the Doge side of things. They have a target of $1 trillion in savings. I'm not too optimistic about them hitting this very idealistic target. However, I do believe that they will be able to accrue some savings. So we can see that as of the current moment, they have already saved $160 billion according to the Doge website. So I believe that Doge will be able to accrue some savings. And if we have a look, I have made some assumptions. So I would assume from the expenses side of things, Doge will be able to save around 10% of the expenses that you see highlighted over here. And they should be able to save around only 5% from the expenses I highlighted over here, which amounts to around $344 billion. So I do believe, that's a more conservative, a more realistic scenario for Doge to be able to save by the end of the year. And assuming based on that, Donald Trump is able to bring down the interest rates on the 10-year Treasury yield side, that will allow the US government to start to lower the deficit and in fact eventually go to the green. And based on this number, the 10-year Treasury yield needs to go down to around 1.5% in order for the balance sheet to be a green at least. So I do believe that is the main target that Donald Trump has. Now that brings us to the next question, which is that Donald Trump has no direct impact to influence 10-year Treasury yields. Now, just to kind of give you an understanding of things, the Fed controls the short end of the yield curve. The markets control the long end of the yield curve. And if we are talking about the 10-year Treasury bonds or 10-year Treasury yield, these are controlled only by the markets. And with all these tariffs, throwing things into uncertainty, that is exactly what Donald Trump wants. Why? Because when the market is uncertain, they tend to flee towards areas of safety. And what is safe in the eyes of most market participants are Treasury bonds. By creating all this uncertainty, Donald Trump hopes to drive people into Treasury markets, raising bond prices, and with that regard, dropping the bond yields itself. Because bond prices and bond yields have an inverse relationship. When bond prices go up, bond yields come down. Similarly, when bond prices go down, bond yields go up. However, what's the problem now is with regards to the short-term treasuries. So this is actually controlled in terms of its yield by the Fed, the Federal Reserve. And we can see that Donald Trump has been consistently pressurizing Jerome Powell to drop the interest rates on the short-term treasuries. Why? It is because currently, if we're talking about a 2-year treasury, the yield is 3.8% versus a 10-year treasury which has a yield of 4.33%. So very simply, today if you were to ask yourself, would I rather wait 2 years to get 3.8% yield, or would I rather wait 10 years and only get 4.33%? I think it's quite straightforward, right? Most people would rather get a 2-year treasury, right? Why would I want to wait 10 years to only get 4.33%? Hence, the only way for the 10-year treasury to become attractive in the eyes of market participants is that the shorter term treasuries need to drop in their yield. And the only person who can control that is Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve. And if you understand this whole entire dynamic, you can see very clearly, all right, why Donald Trump are making certain actions, saying certain things about the Federal Reserve, because his main objective right now and urgently is to try and refinance all this $9 trillion in debt that's maturing in 2025 ASAP at the lowest rates possible. And I believe this is exactly what Donald Trump's secret plan is, alongside Doge, to bring down the interest rates to as low as possible for the refinancing and to put the US government balance sheet in a better situation. Now, if you found this video useful, do me a favor, like it and share it with someone that you think will benefit from this video. Also, if you find that I might be missing out on any details, feel free to drop in the comments below. As always, this is Ian Teo, the top 1% Realtor, signing out.